Amen. Welcome back. I hope everyone slept well. We began camp meeting last night with a bit of an introduction to our topic. We began the process of reviewing this message as it has opened up over the last 3 years. Before we began that journey with Acts 27, we revised the presentation from Sabbath, and the main point I wanted us to pick up from that, to remember from that, was this repeating pattern, and the fact that in each one of these 4 dispensations, there is a message that does the work of ploughing, functions as the early rain, functions as the latter rain, and also harvests. So we find that there's always this message, because it's a message that does a work within us. Once we became familiar with that concept, which I think for most of us is already quite familiar, we located ourselves on the reform line, which we identified as being just prior to our close of probation, in really those final moments of time as the third angel's message comes to a close. We went to the book Early Writings. We looked at the chapter, the third message closed, comes directly after the chapter titled The Loud Cry, and she talks about this period of the closing of the third angel's message. And she says that just prior to the time that this message closes, the people receive the latter rain, or the refreshing from the presence of the Lord. She says the living testimony is revived, and that last great warning has sounded everywhere. That last great warning is the loud cry of the previous chapter. That warning has sounded everywhere, and it has divided 2 groups of people. The people who are divided by the message are the people who were designed to have received it. So in the context of this chapter, she's talking about the final scenes of Earth's history on that line of the 144,000. And at the loud cry, the people that were to have received it are the world. So in this context, it's the world. But as we break that down into a fractal, we find that in our history, the people that were to have received the midnight cry message were those who were designed, who should have been part of the priesthood, who made up our number, entered into the movement in prior history before or after 2014, entered into the movement, and they were to receive this midnight cry message. But as they reject it, it stirs up and enrages them. So it has these opposite effects. For one group, it prepares them for the time of trouble. For another group, it stirs and enrages them. And the work of the midnight cry, as part of the everlasting gospel, is to create and demonstrate 2 classes of people, which is precisely what we have seen evidenced in the last 2 months within this movement. There are people within our movement who look at this shaking as if it's a moral quarrel between the leadership, that somehow we have different personalities and we don't get along. That's a dangerous misunderstanding of prophecy. This shaking was and should have been expected by God's people. It's laid out in prophecy. In fact, if we conduct our reform lines properly and we know that this waymark is the cross, you know what happens to the disciples just prior to the cross. Who leaves the table, who runs away. You know that there's going to be a division prior to the close of probation. So what I wanted us to do was to step through the last 5 years, our own dispensation, and see what God has unsealed and what understandings he has one by one progressively introduced to this movement. What journey he's taken us on, so that in our own minds we can have a clearer picture of exactly where God has brought us. It began in 2016 with Acts 27. This was an opening up of Paul's journey from Caesarea through to the island of Melita and then to Rome. So for the purpose of Acts 27, that chapter itself is the journey of two ships, the ship of Adramyttium and the ship of Alexandria. And what we were able to place by seeing the symbols in this chapter, placing it on a reform line, is giving us the journey of this ship as representing the journey of two parallel institutions. Those institutions, the United States and Adventism. We spoke of most of our presentations of these reform lines, the 144,000, the priests, the Levites, and the Nethinims. We have these 4 reform lines that we work off. And for some time in this movement, we have referred to Raffia as midnight, Padium as the midnight cry, and Sunday law as a shut door, or at that point just Sunday law. So we were speaking about these waymarks as midnight, midnight cry, Sunday law. And that pattern does not exist in any one of these reform lines. We had no excuse to make that type of application. But Acts 27 gives us a 5th line, and that is a line that does not teach us of people, but teaches us of the United States and Adventism as institutions. And it shows us how Raffia and Padium become midnight, the midnight cry, and Sunday law then becomes a closed door, shut door, or close of probation. So I've listed the 2 points we took from this study, the compare and the contrast of the United States and Adventism, and this line of institutions. And we've been able to glean quite a bit of truth from that, seeing how these 2 institutions have really 2 stories woven together. And the history that we've most tried to highlight is 1863, how they both go off course, the United States as a country in 1863, and Adventism also with their rejection of the 2520. This then took us through an understanding of the 273 into the history of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, linking this 273, showing it as a waymark between Padium and Sunday law, took us to 273 BC, and a waymark between Padium and Sunday law. But the subject matter has changed. Now we're talking about wars between the king of the north and the king of the south, between Rome and Greece. So first of all was our study of Acts 27, and I'll leave these charts up after the presentation if you want to see these expanded into their full format. So we have Acts 27. What developed after Acts 27 was the history of Pyrrhus, the king of the south fighting against Rome. And at that point in time, we're only covering that Amiga history where he's fighting in Italy. What this begins to teach us, Pyrrhus, it begins to open up the triple application of prophecy. It's teaching us that World War I, not yet at this point understood, plus World War II equals World War III. This is what begins to develop out of this understanding of Pyrrhus. Another point that Pyrrhus teaches us. We've spoken for some time about the battles of Raphia and Panium. Pyrrhus teaches us that there are 4 battles between the king of the north and the king of the south on our reform line, or involving the king of the north and the king of the south, not 2. So we move our understanding from raphia and panium, and that expands to seeing 4 battles within our reform line. What Pyrrhus also teaches us begins to open up an understanding of the mode of warfare used in these 4 battles. And we'll discuss that again. So Pyrrhus begins to open up. This is all in the last couple of months of 2016. Pyrrhus continues to be expanded until we see it go back and start to explain the history of a Cold War and the history of World War II. Now we have not just 285 to 272 or 1989 to Sunday Law. Now we have a whole Alpha history incorporated into there. Now we have an understanding of World War II. This, as I said before, opening up our triple application of prophecy. With this, we have an understanding, also a study done on the leaders of Epirus, the king of the south in this history, and the Soviet Union or Russia in this history. Lining up their leaders, we're able to identify Pyrrhus as Vladimir Putin and also Vladimir Putin as Joseph Stalin. You can see that Putin and Stalin are the same person just based on the structure. But the pattern of leadership between the nation of Epirus and the Soviet Union and then Russia gives us a secondary witness to say in a much more emphatic fashion that Pyrrhus typified Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin was also typified by Joseph Stalin, again taking us back to the history of World War II, which we discussed here. Then this study was taken. If Stalin typifies Vladimir Putin, then the alpha explains the end, and we have license to cut this line and overlay the alpha and the omega histories. That's what has been done here. The alpha line of Pyrrhus, the omega line of Pyrrhus, the alpha line with Stalin, the omega line with Putin. So now we're directly overlaying the history of World War II and Joseph Stalin with the history of Vladimir Putin and World War III. This is all in around the middle months of 2017. This begins to be developed. Towards the September, October of 2017, November 9 begins to work its way into this message without design. We have a few different themes that we're working at the same time. So I want to break this down. We'll do that towards the end of our presentation, but you may see that we're discussing a few different themes, but those themes are also woven together. We have a story of Adventism. We also have a story of the King of the South connected to the King of the North. And what begins to open up in November of 2017 is an understanding then of the papacy, the counterfeit. It was November 11 of 2017 that the counterfeit began to open up. And that was with an understanding of Fatima. A book was being read, the book known as Hitler's Pope, and again, the reason Hitler's Pope was being read is because it's explaining the role of the Catholic Church in the history of World War II. World War II was already a topic of our reform line. So now that World War II is being discussed, what was being looked into was the way that the papacy responded to this history of World War II and how they tried to capitalize off this conflict. So Fatima is studied, and it begins to be recognized that this history of Fatima belongs on a reform line. That in that history of 1917, you can observe Satan working through a counterfeit reform line. Adventism has had has had an understanding for a long time about how Satan operates. We've always understood that he works through counterfeiting, and we see that most clearly every time we talk about the Sabbath. We have Saturday Sabbath, so they have their Sunday Sabbath. And we understand that Satan has operated through this work of counterfeiting the gospel. What we've understood since 1989 in much more detail is how God interacts with his people. We've been able to plot that operation onto reform lines and see patterns through history of how God interacts with his church. And as we see how God interacts with his church, we saw that that was through the everlasting gospel. And what is the everlasting gospel? The understanding of this movement. It's a 3-step prophetic testing message. And what Fatima begins to introduce to our understanding is that if God works through a 3-step prophetic testing message, how was Satan going to work? He's going to work through a counterfeit, everlasting gospel. And this begins to open up how Satan works in a prophetic sense with his own church. If God works, if God scatters, punishes, gathers his people through a prophetic message on a reform line, then Satan must scatter his people, gather them through a 3-step prophetic testing message. He's going to counterfeit how God works with his church, and Satan is going to use the same method to raise up his own people at the end of the world. Moving away from the study of the counterfeit, what began to develop from these studies was a further development on the mode of warfare. We have the chart for the leadership of Epirus and Russia. We have the chart for the overlaying of those lines. This one here. Alpha, Omega. We see the repeating pattern. And we have the counterfeit reform line of Fatima. The 3 secrets, the 3-step prophetic testing message, a message of hell, a message of a work that needs to be done, a message of judgment. And now what begins to be studied is the mode of warfare observed in these 4 battles. And what begins to be understood is that each age in Earth's history operates through the latest technological development that they have access to. In the Stone Age, they operated with stone weapons. In the Iron Age, with iron weapons. In the Bronze Age, with bronze weapons. What age are we in now? We're in the information age, and it's not a coincidence that the big bang of the information age was 1989. So we began to trace this thread of the information age through history. We didn't begin it in 1989. We began to see that there's two 10-year histories prior to 1989 where you can already see this development that leads to the so-called Big Bang of 1989. We began it with 1969. This is ARPANET. It's the invention of the internet. 1979. This is the beginning of the FISA court. It introduces government surveillance, the surveillance we see such a contentious topic today. And a court case, Smith versus Maryland. So we're not reviewing these studies, but to bring back to your memory, it was Smith versus Maryland and the FISA court. And then in 1989, the invention of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee released a paper titled Information Management, a Proposal, 1990. He created the world's first web browser in 1991. He released it to the public. So you have 1989 to 91. As we've said before, our increase of knowledge externally, the development of the World Wide Web and the creation of the internet as we have it today. And this is how we connect waymarks, how we thread a story. Later on in our presentations, you may have been noticing in the last few weeks some momentous external events. Just to highlight one of them, what's been happening in the Middle East with ISIS and Baghdadi. If you want to understand ISIS, 1989, start threading your waymarks. And that's a subject that we discussed really from the beginning of the year in Brazil. That methodology of tracing your story through successive waymarks and seeing that story build. I said before that constructing a whole reform line is a protection mechanism to prevent us from making mistakes. Threading waymarks is the same thing. If you can trace the story of the information age through 1989, through 2016, which is typified as a battle by prior history, then you know that when you get to Raffia and it says a battle, you know what that battle's going to look like. And threading our waymarks is a protection mechanism. It protects us from making incorrect applications. I think all of us know that Russia and the United States in a few days are not about to bomb each other. We can already see that. But a year ago, people were expecting just that. People who claimed to accept this message may have been fighting it. People who now reject this message should go back to expecting a battle in a couple of days. But they won't because they know it's ridiculous. But we know that if we thread our waymarks, we won't come up with such a silly application. We're in an information age and it's an information war. So it was the study of the information age, threading that development of the mode of warfare. The next study developed was by taking what we were seeing externally. By now it's around the year 2018. So 2018 has begun. And what is developing now is an understanding that what we are seeing externally, what we have been seeing externally for years in the past, is paralleling what we see internally within the movement. We have the external and the internal. At first, this study was only done from around 2012 to 2016. It's been able to be expanded from 2009 to 2019. But at the beginning, it was the years of 12 to 16. It really can, if stretched out, though, encompass these whole two dispensations. This parallel between internal and external. And what we were particularly paralleling was this message that came in 2012. It began to explain to us why we saw this shaking in 2013 that climaxed in 2014, the path of the just, and also the rejection of this movement of the message of time. We understand that in 2012, the message of time was introduced to the movement leadership rejected it. And you can see that history externally with the events that led up to 2014 and the election of Donald Trump. And that chart that will show this one from 2009 to 2019 expanded shows that internal and external interaction. I want to just make a point about this. There's an internal movement that leads us to the final events of Earth's history, that movement beginning in 1989. So we know that we're this final movement. But externally, does the United States have a final movement? Yes, they have a final movement that's rising up and bringing together church and state, is going to create an image to the beast and a Sunday law. So you know we have an internal movement that leads us all the way to the Sunday law where we do a work, and they have an external movement that leads them to the Sunday law, and they're going to do a work. So all that we have done is seen this parallel, the compare and the contrast between the internal and the external. As these studies are being developed, the methodology that we're using becomes clearer and clearer as being that of parable teaching. And you may have noticed in the last period of time, probably longer than that, but probably I would suggest most clearly in the last few years, you've seen Elder Parminder introduce parable teaching and the rules of parable teaching. And one of the methods of parable teaching is to compare and contrast. A parable, a parabola, you've seen those studies, taking two things that don't seem to belong and forcing them to fit, and then comparing and contrasting between those two objects. You've seen it done as two ships lined up for battle. And there's this compare and the contrast between these two ships. That's the methodology that you're going to see threaded through all of these studies. You come to this study and we've taken the external movement that leads to the Sunday law where they do a work, and the internal movement that leads to the Sunday law where they do a work, and forced them together and compare and contrasted. And if you contrast, you know that one is bad, it opposes the Sunday law, and it enforces the Sunday law, and one is good, it opposes the Sunday law. So you can contrast them, but you can also compare them. They are two final movements. And when you compare them, you understand that this external movement, who leads it? Donald Trump. Compare and contrast. If you haven't seen those studies, it's not as clear. Compare and contrast. Who led this? So the claim made today that the leadership of this movement is not the true leadership, that a mistake has been made and we're about to be cast aside, you would have to go to this study and say Donald Trump is about to be kicked out of office and Obama is going to return. And you know the study doesn't teach that. Trump leads the final movement all the way to Sunday law and beyond. Elder Parminder, compare and contrast all through this history. 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 19, and you see the internal and the external is Donald Trump and Elder Parminder. Donald Trump is facing an impeachment by his enemies. What do you expect to see internally? Who wants to overturn the leadership of this movement that has been in place since 2014? You're seeing an internal process of impeachment. Externally, it's going to fail. We know that prophetically. Internally, what's going to happen? Fail. It's already written in prophecy. So this external and internal study is done, and what it particularly brings, the parallel of the external and the internal, it brings with it a couple of applications. The first one is an understanding of 2014, already placed in prophecy as the Sunday law. Now we can pinpoint more accurately why it had to be the Sunday law. It lined up Trump with Elder Parminder, and as soon as that study was developed, I understood, even if other leaders had not come to that understanding, namely Elder Jeff, that Elder Parminder was the leader of the movement, purely based on the parallel with the external. Around this time, a further, much more in-depth study begins into November 9. It has become an impossible subject to entirely avoid. There was, up to this point, no concerted effort to see November 9 as anything significant. But it became clearer through all these other studies that not just this date, I don't want us to just emphasize the date, but the year of 2019 had a special significance in prophecy. And the first way that this begins to become unavoidable is an understanding of the 10-year cycles. We've seen just a couple of them when we talk about 69, 79, 89. If you were to go into the history of World War I and World War II, you're dealing with 1919, 1929, 1939, the Soviet Union develops their first nuclear weapons. You start seeing this, 1939, World War II, 1939. 1949, the Soviet Union develops their first nuclear weapons. NATO is formed. Comecon is formed. Germany officially divided between East and West. So you have this 10-year cycle that was impossible to escape from. If we were to just highlight some of them, particularly through the history of the First and the Second World Wars. This is just an example, can be expanded. So it began to be recognized that 2019 as a year held significance for us, internally and externally. At this point, a much more determined, thorough investigation began into 2019, this time with intent. It's not a coincidence that those videos from 2012, where Elder Parminder is studying in Wales the prediction of 2014 as Sunday law, those videos had been lost to the movement. They were believed to be entirely lost, those taped studies, up until just recently, where someone found that they still had a recording of one of those studies stored. And it's only in the last couple of weeks that we have been able to access one of those studies from 2012. I don't think it's a coincidence that that has been given back to the movement, and the man that actually discovered that he had that study and gave it to us has very soon after left the movement. So he had no design of saving it for a special date or a special purpose. But that has been reintroduced to the movement. And you may know from that prediction of 2012 when 2014 was predicted, one of the ways that it was predicted was by observing this subject of the 126 and the 151, that there are numbers with significant numbers for this movement that take us from dates in history, the 151 being 1863, the 126 being 1888. So I began to use this same methodology in trying to understand why 2019 seemed to be this unavoidable subject. And what developed there was the subject of 2019 through prophetic time spans. It showed 2019 by taking us back into history using these prophetic time spans. Some of the things we expected to see a protest within this movement by church and state, the restraint of radical Islam. We expected to see the beginning of a presidential impeachment. Just a couple of the subjects that we began to expect would occur this year, and in the closing presentations at this camp meeting, we'll begin to revisit some of those expectations that developed then. So 2019 by timelines. Gave us our predictions of 2019 and began to introduce 2019 as our close of probation, although this understanding came gradually in the early to middle months of 2018. Around May of 2018 last year, there was a study, a school in Australia, a school of the prophets held in Australia, down just south of Melbourne. Elder Parminder came as our teacher, and just like we'd had the opportunity in Wales to sit and discuss, this gave us an opportunity to sit and discuss these studies. It was one particular night we began to study the timelines of 2019, and I laid out what the thoughts that had been developing over this time. Towards the end of that study, we revisited 2014. When we revisited 2014, we began to understand that 2014 has peculiar characteristic in Millerite history. And again, we've discussed that on Sabbath, and we discussed that in last night's presentation. 2014 is the waymark of Sunday law. If it's the waymark of Sunday law, what waymark does it line up with in Millerite history? (2014) lines up with July 21st. And July 21st is known as midway or midnight, between the tarrying time of April 19 and the shut door of October 22. It was recognised that if July 21 has its symbology of midway or midnight, first the literal and then the spiritual. Literally midway, literally midnight, 2014 becomes a symbolic or spiritual midway or midnight between 9/11, the tarrying time, and our close of probation. So it was understood that 2014 was a point of midway, and what developed in that study was an understanding that if this has the symbology of midway, 2014 has the symbology of midway. And if we're going to take it back to 1863, through the 151, we're going to go from the literal to the symbolic. So 1863, the literal, must then be literally midway in a history. And we find that it is. It's literally midway in the American Civil War. So we find 1863 is midway, 2014 is midway. And then we found you could do a 490 back, identify it as a midway. You could do a 220 back to the French Revolution and find it's midway in the French Revolution. You could do a 126 back to 1888 and see it as a midway point. So those prophetic time spans that take us to 2014 identify 2014 as symbolically the midway point. And that gives us other waymarks such as 1865 to explain what our close of probation looks like. I want to detour here just to make one point. 1865, through this study of midway, is what waymark? It's the close of probation, which we understand to be 2019. 1865 is the end of the Civil War. You have this history from 63 to 65, where you have this president within the United States, and what is Abraham Lincoln doing? What is the North doing in this history of 63 to 65? This is Abraham Lincoln, where 1865 equals 2019. You have Abraham Lincoln introducing church and state. This is the sin of the North. So is Lincoln good or bad? It depends on the story. In this story, when it's a story of church and state, 1863, the beginning of the national reform movement that began to introduce the Sunday laws that A.T. Jones fought against, this happened in the North under the watch of Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln, in this context, is bad. 1865 equals 2019, this history equaling this history and the introduction of church and state into America. The introduction of church and state into America. But if you take 1865, this is through the study of midway, it equals 2019. If you take the 1865 waymark and add 151 years, where does it take you to? Not 2019, it takes you to 2016. What I want us to see is that Abraham Lincoln can represent two different people depending on the story. He can represent someone good in one story and someone bad in another story. So 1865 plus the 151 takes us to 2016. And Abraham Lincoln is a president of the United States fighting against slavery, which is essentially racism. So you have a president in the United States fighting against racism. What happens to him in 1865? He's assassinated by someone who sympathizes with the South. This is the sin of the South, racism. And in comes a president, Andrew Johnson, the first US president in history that's going to be impeached. Not removed from government, that's not what impeached means, but he's going to have impeachment proceedings against him. Andrew Johnson, who is favourable to the South, who believes in slavery, who is a racist, he's going to take the place of Abraham Lincoln. So in 1865, you have a transition take place between a president who is fighting racism and a president who is on the side of racism or slavery. So 1865 also equals 2016. In this context, who is Lincoln? Obama. 2016, you have the end of a president who is against slavery and the beginning of a president who is for slavery. 2016, the end of a president who is against racism, the beginning of a president who is for racism, and is Lincoln in this story good or bad? There's two stories, two different compare and contrasts you can see in the Civil War. The North was good. It was fighting against slavery, but it's the North that introduces church and state into America. So you have Abraham Lincoln representing someone good at the end of the world, Obama fighting against that issue of racism. You also have him as someone bad at the end of the world, someone who will introduce church and state. In this dispensation, 63 to 65, in this dispensation, 2014 the work began, 2019, I hope you're following the external events. The reason I wanted to highlight this point is I made the point before, who is Donald Trump internally? Elder Parminder, the answer should be it depends. Is Donald Trump good or bad? Depends on your story. If it's a story of the final movement, you bring him internally and he's good. If you want to talk about a dictator and how that dictator operates, it's not Elder Parminder within this movement. So we're going to visit that at a later point, but I want us to see that while you can do this compare and contrast with Trump and Parminder, that Trump can be someone good and someone bad. Abraham Lincoln has this dual application, Donald Trump has this dual internal application. That was a slight detour. 2014, what begins to open up to this movement is the understanding of midnight or midway. And we highlight 1863 because we learn so much from that history. But there are others. It's also the French Revolution, various histories that are midway points taking us to this dispensation. So this study on midway, it gives us a beginning of an understanding of civil war in our day. It begins to explain what's happening when you bring that issue of the issues of 1863 and church and state into our history of 14 to 19. Now that the subject of civil war was introduced, actually on that same night, we came to the firm conclusion that it was not possible for 2019, that waymark, to be anything other than the close of probation. That understanding became emphatic. Soon after 2014 was studied, and we understood the Civil War application into our own time, a study began into the revolutions. It had already begun, but now the midway points really gave it what it needed. And this became the strongest evidence for November 9 as a date. We used the French Revolution, the American Civil War, the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the French Revolution in a secondary application. All of these taking us to a stronger understanding of November 9 in history and in application. What the revolutions brought to our understanding was November 9 as an endpoint of an ongoing revolution since 9/11, and it also gave us an understanding of 2020, 2020 being the counter-revolution. So you know that in 2020 there must be waymarks that line up with this concept of a counter-revolution. Again, we're in an information war. It's in the information age. They're using information weapons, and it's not a coincidence that 2020 is an election year. The study of the revolutions. Connected but separate to that study of the revolutions was a study into the American revolutions. I'll have to rub out this work if you don't mind. Am I all right to rub this out? I'll give you separate to this study of the revolutions, but connected to it, was a study of the American Revolution. The Civil War was placed in that context. It lines up with that pattern, but the American Revolution was understood in a different way. And that was through the halving of the 490. So through these studies, it began to be thought, and I don't want to go into any detail here, but just a side note, that in understanding the American Revolution, it gave added weight to this understanding of the revolutions, another witness for 2019 as a significant year. It brought us to 2019. It also showed us 2020, but there was also an understanding, began to be understood that we could begin to see significance in 2021. The final study that began to be developed and refined just prior to October of last year, where these elements were, where these different studies were presented, was taking us back to our understanding of Fatima and the counterfeit. This is our understanding of Satan's work in counterfeiting God's work with his church. It's the same concept of Fatima, but much more refined and developed. And we began to see that there is this counterfeit at work between the true, or the way God interacts with his church, and Alpha and Omega histories of modern Israel. And we began to see that Satan could counterfeit and interact in the same way with his own church, with Alpha and Omega histories of modern Babylon. So the same pattern that we see within modern Israel we see within modern Babylon. Again, the methodology we're using, parable teaching, compare and contrast modern Israel with modern Babylon. And the more you see that methodology used, separate to the immense amount of evidence throughout inspiration that is how God operates, it also consistently is proven through these studies that you can see a compare and contrast between modern Israel and modern Babylon. What this study brought to our understanding was our understanding of what we will go into later. We're going to go into the counterfeit in our next presentations in much more detail, but it gave us an understanding of Alpha and Omega histories in modern Babylon. Separate to that, it also started to teach us of what we already knew from the history of Pyrrhus, but another witness of histories of failure, Alpha, and success, Omega. We're going to come back and discuss that in tomorrow's presentations. So at this point, just after the presentation of the counterfeit, we're now in October. October 3 to 13 of 2018, which we identify as our midnight cry. And all of this was there presented. But the message didn't stop being taught or developed. And in the last months of 2018, this was added to. Now, going back to that presentation in October, at that school in Arkansas, before this message had been presented, there was a brother there from Brazil, Brother Daniel, and he began to share at the little table where I was sitting for lunch. He began to share primarily with Elder Parminder, but in our hearing, that he had calculated October 13 to be the midnight cry. He'd already recognized that prior to the beginning of the sharing of this message. And he'd done that in a number of different ways that I won't go into now. But Brother Daniel, a brother from Brazil, began to expect that he was about to hear the midnight cry message and the prediction of the close of probation. Other people since then have tried to lay claim to that prediction. And I was at that table before any of these presentations began to be taught that had already been done, already been expected by our brother from Brazil. These presentations were taught, and Elder Jeff gave a warning that I wish he would revisit. He said that the people who are confronted with this message will be tested. They will be tested based on whether or not they're willing to put their faith on reform lines. Reform lines are the truth that began to open up in 1989. At this crucial testing point before our close of probation, what tests us is whether or not we're going to trust our reform lines. He identified that himself. The sad point is that he wasn't one of those people who realized he could trust them. You need to know the message for yourself, understand these lines enough to be able to say, this makes sense. This is God's leading, not man's leading. I hope that we're all able to do that. So tomorrow we're going to finish. We just have a little bit to do to finish this work of revision. We've worked our way all the way through from the increase of knowledge 2016 to the formalization in 2018 in October of last year. There's a couple more truths or concepts that came out of these studies since October. We will revisit them tomorrow, and then I want us to begin looking particularly at the counterfeit. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, that you give us so much evidence that you love us, that you want to work with us. Father, in these momentous events that you have a plan for us, Lord, I pray that we will be encouraged, that we will truly have faith that you have led, and that you have not just led us, but all the lines that we trust give us a strong conviction that you will continue to lead us all the way to the end. I pray that we'll put our faith in you and that we will become firmer and firmer in our convictions as we approach our close of probation. Thank you for how you have blessed and how you have led us as a people for 30 years, Lord, and for the last 5. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.